The sky had turned an angry shade of gray, and the wind whipped through the fields like a wild beast. Thomas, a humble farmer, pulled his coat tighter as he shut the creaking door of his barn. The day had been long. He had spent hours tending to the soil, fixing fences, and making sure his animals had enough hay for the night. His boots were heavy with mud, and all he wanted was to sit by the fire with his wife and children, but just as he turned toward his small cottage, a shadow moved at the edge of the road. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the storm. The rain poured so heavily that shapes blurred, and the lightning flashed across the fields like jagged knives. But then he saw the figure stumble, almost falling to his knees before dragging himself upright again. Thomas felt a tug in his chest. Many travelers passed by, merchants on their way to the city or wanderers seeking fortune, but this man looked different. His clothes were torn, his hair plastered to his face by the rain, and his steps were unsteady as though every ounce of strength had already been spent. Without thinking, Thomas grabbed a lantern and ran toward the road. The mud sucked at his boots, but he pressed on until he reached the man. Up close, the stranger looked even worse. His skin was pale, his lips trembling from the cold, and his hands shook as he clutched a worn satchel that seemed to contain his only possessions. His eyes lifted to Thomas, desperate and hollow, as though he had been wandering far too long without rest or food. "You'll catch your death out here," Thomas said over the roar of the storm. "Come with me." The man opened his mouth to reply, but only a faint rasp escaped his throat. He looked too weak to speak. So Thomas slung the man's arm over his shoulder and carried him toward the cottage. Inside, the warmth of the fire glowed, and the scent of stew filled the room. His wife, Margaret, gasped when she saw them. "Who is this?" she asked, rushing to clear a space near the hearth. "A traveler," Thomas replied. "He won't last the night if we leave him out there." Margaret nodded, her worry giving way to instinctive kindness. She fetched dry clothes, an old wool blanket, and a bowl of stew. The couple's 2 children, still small and wide-eyed, peeked from behind the doorway, whispering to each other about the stranger who had suddenly entered their home. Slowly, with trembling hands, the man took the food. His fingers were rough, blistered from long days on the road, but he ate with quiet gratitude, savoring every bite as though it were the first real meal he had tasted in weeks. He murmured a soft, "Thank you," his voice hoarse, before sipping from the cup of water Thomas handed him. When his strength returned a little, he introduced himself simply as Elias. He did not speak much about where he had come from, nor why he traveled alone. There was a heaviness in his eyes, the kind of silence carried by men who had endured things too painful to explain. But Thomas and Margaret did not pry. In their eyes, he was just a man in need, and that was enough. That night, Thomas laid an extra blanket on the straw mattress near the fire, while Margaret whispered, "We have little to give, yet you open our homes so easily." Thomas smiled faintly. "Kindness is worth more than gold. Someday, our children will learn that from us." For 3 days, Elias remained with them. He helped Thomas with small chores as his strength returned, mending the chicken coop, gathering water from the well, and chopping wood for the fire. Though still quiet, he began to smile at the children's playful chatter, and at night, he would sit by the fire, staring into the flames as if searching for something he had lost on the morning he was ready to leave. Thomas walked with him to the edge of the village road. The storm had long passed, and the fields glistened under the pale light of dawn. Elias carried his satchel again, though his steps were steadier now. Before leaving, he turned to Thomas, grasped his hand firmly, and said words that would linger in the farmer's memory for years. "I will never forget your kindness. One day, it will return to you." And with that, he walked away, disappearing down the long road until he became no more than a small figure swallowed by the horizon. Thomas stood there a while, the morning air crisp against his face, not knowing that this simple act of sheltering a stranger would one day save not just his family, but the entire village. The years slipped by quietly in the little village. Life for Thomas continued much as it always had: early mornings in the fields, long days of tending to crops, evenings spent with his family by the fire. The memory of the stormy night when Elias had arrived grew softer with time, tucked away like an old story told occasionally to the children. Still, Thomas remembered the stranger's parting words, though he never expected they would mean more than simple gratitude. But peace, like seasons, does not last forever. One summer, dark clouds came, not from the sky, but from the mountains. Word spread that a band of raiders had descended on nearby settlements, burning homes, stealing livestock, and driving out families who had lived on the land for generations. Fear settled over Thomas's village like a shadow. They were farmers, not fighters. Their tools were plows, not swords. What defense could they possibly muster? The morning the raiders arrived was heavy with dread. A column of smoke rose in the distance before the first cries rang out. Horses thundered down the road, and men with cruel eyes and rough armor swept through the fields. They carried torches and blades, shouting threats as they rounded up livestock and looted food stores. The villagers tried to resist, but a few men with sticks and farm tools were no match for hardened warriors. Thomas clutched his son and daughter close, pushing them behind him as Margaret held their hands, her face pale with fear. "Leave what you can and run to the woods," one of the older farmers urged. "It's the only way we'll survive." Thomas's heart ached. Abandon their land, their home, everything they had built would be reduced to ashes. Yet he saw the hopelessness in his neighbors' eyes and knew they were powerless. Just as he was about to gather his family to flee, a sound cut through the chaos, the sharp, disciplined rhythm of hooves pounding in unison. From the ridge overlooking the valley came a sight none of them expected. A formation of riders, armored and orderly, descended like a wave of steel. At their head rode a man whose presence seemed to command the earth itself. His armor gleamed even beneath the smoke-filled sky, and a standard bearing a golden crest fluttered behind him. He raised his hand, and the riders spread out with precision, encircling the raiders. The villagers froze, watching as the two forces clashed. The raiders, used to preying on defenseless farmers, were caught off guard by the discipline and strength of the soldiers. Blades clashed, horses reared, and the once confident invaders began to falter under the weight of the charge. Within minutes, the tide turned. The raiders, who had seemed unstoppable, were being driven back, scattered like chaff before the wind. Thomas could hardly believe his eyes. Who were these men, and who was the commander who led them with such unwavering authority? Then, as the battle subsided and the raiders fled into the hills, the commander dismounted and strode toward the villagers. His steps were sure, his gaze firm, but when his eyes fell on Thomas, a warmth spread across his face. Thomas's breath caught in his chest. He knew those eyes, though they now burned with strength instead of weariness. It was Elias, the stranger from the stormy night so many years ago. The man he had once carried into his home, weak and broken, now stood tall as a general leading soldiers into battle. Elias grasped Thomas's shoulders, just as he had once grasped his hand on the edge of the road, and said in a voice that carried both gratitude and triumph, "Your kindness saved me when I had nothing. Today, I return that gift." The villagers, still stunned, began to cheer. Children ran forward, their fear forgotten, as Elias's soldiers assured the people that their village would be safe. Margaret's eyes welled with tears, and Thomas's children clung to their mother, staring in awe at the man who had come back like a hero from one of their bedtime stories. That night, for the first time since the raiders had appeared, the village slept without fear. Fires were extinguished, homes were spared, and livestock was returned. Elias's men patrolled the roads, ensuring no harm would come again. And around the great bonfire where the villagers gathered, Elias stood before them all and declared, "This village will always be under my protection. No blade will touch it while I draw breath." Thomas listened with his heart full, humbled by the circle that had closed. Years ago, he had opened his door to a stranger with nothing to give but weary gratitude. Now that same man had returned, not as a wanderer, but as a shield, a guardian strong enough to save them all. As the night wore on and the stars stretched white across the sky, Thomas sat quietly by the fire with his family, watching Elias laugh with the villagers, his soldiers sharing food and drink with the farmers. And he realized that acts of kindness, no matter how small or simple, ripple outward like stones cast into a pond. They may vanish from sight, but they are never truly gone. One day, they return, often in ways far greater than anyone can imagine.